Okay, so welcome back everyone. Let's get started. So today we're talking about sleep and dreams, and to start with I want to show you this cute video of a hummingbird sleeping.
A scientist in Peru captured this, escaping from the tiny body of a sleeping hummingbird. A high-pitched but unmistakable snore. Hummingbirds are loved for their beauty and speed, but this one was behaving a little bit like a human. The perfect cute response trigger.
Okay, so sleep occurs very widely across the animal kingdom. So birds sleep, mammals sleep. So on the left here is Sunny, my cat, who's a very dedicated sleeper. Fish sleep, apparently. Even insects sleep. And so this species of fly is diurnal, like us, which means that it sleeps at night and is awake during the day. And as humans, we spend something like a third of our lives asleep. And so there's this paradox to sleep, that on one hand, it occurs so widely across the animal kingdom that it must be serving some kind of vital function for life. But on the other hand, when we're asleep, we're in this really vulnerable state. We're disconnected from the world around us. We're not able to understand or respond to things happening around us. And so it feels like it ought to be a disadvantage for us to be spending so much time asleep. We all know that when we sleep, when we are deprived of sleep, rather, it affects our cognitive state. And so it can make us kind of moody and depressed. It can make it difficult to concentrate, hard to remember things. And there's a range of research that's been done over the last kind of decade or two that has found a number of different links between poor sleep and health outcomes like depression and cardiovascular problems and things like that. However, it's still something of a mystery why we need to sleep so much and exactly what's happening inside our brain and our body when we're asleep that's able to have these effects on our health and our cognitive state when we're awake. In this lecture, I'm going to start by focusing on the daily cycle of sleep that we all experience, an extended period of wakefulness and then an extended period of sleep. And this will include talking a bit about a particular mechanism in the brain called the SCN that has a key role in regulating that cycle. We'll look a bit at what's happening inside of our brain while we sleep, talk about some key disorders of sleep that people can experience, and then at the end I'll outline some of the main ideas about why we sleep and why we dream. So by the end of the lecture, you should be able to explain the role of the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or SCN, in controlling rhythms of sleep, compare different stages of sleep that we go through during the night, contrast different sleeping disorders, and outline some of the possible functions of sleep. Okay, so generally our experience of sleep is that of a daily cycle, an extended period awake and then an extended period asleep. We all know that this can be influenced by exogenous cues, so meaning stimuli in our environment that we're exposed to. And so the sun flooding into our room in the morning can wake us up. If we drink a strong coffee in the afternoon or in the evening, it can often delay the onset of sleep. And if we make the mistake of checking our email just before we go to bed, often that can give us new things to think about when we want to be sleeping. But it turns out that in addition to these exogenous cues that influence our sleep is also largely determined by something called an endogenous circadian rhythm. So endogenous here means something that's generated inside of our body or inside of our brain. And a circadian rhythm is a cycle that occurs once about every 24 hours, so once a day. And the effect of this endogenous circadian rhythm can be illustrated by looking at how sleep occurs when people or other animals are kept in environments that limit those exogenous cues that can affect sleep, like sunlight. So this plot is from a study where they were studying the sleeping patterns of flying squirrels, and they kept these squirrels in total darkness for 25 days. The plot on the right, what it illustrates, each row is 1 day, so one 24-hour period. And the squirrels sleep a lot, so the thin lines here are indicating when this particular squirrel is sleeping, and the thick line is indicating when it's awake. And so the main point to take from this plot here is that even in the absence of exogenous cues to when the day is starting and ending, like sunlight, this squirrel is still undergoing this regular cycle in its sleep, where it's sleeping for an extended period each day and then spending a period of about 8 hours kind of awake each day. So suggesting that pattern to its sleep is determined internally. It doesn't depend on exposure to the sun going up and down each day. As another example or way of illustrating this endogenous circadian rhythm, this plot is from a study where they kept humans, so adults, awake for about 2 days, and in an environment which again limited those external cues to the time. And so in this case they were kept in just kind of constant dim light. So they didn't know like when the sun was setting and rising and so on. In grey here is an indication of the release of melatonin in their body. And so we'll talk about melatonin a little bit more later in the lecture, but briefly it's a hormone that's produced naturally in our body. It's released into our bloodstream and has a role in promoting sleep. And so in these people in the study, as night approached, melatonin was being released into their bloodstream. It peaked sort of midway through the night and then went down again by morning, even though the person hadn't actually slept in that time. So it's this chemical process happening in the body that's promoting sleep at a certain time, even in the absence of external cues like sunlight that signal when it's nighttime. In the black markers here indicate subjective ratings of sleepiness that the subjects gave, and you can see that as night approaches and goes on, they're getting sleepier and sleepier, and then when morning comes, even though they haven't actually slept at all, their sleepiness kind of levels off a bit and even goes down. And you may have experienced something similar to this yourself, that if you stay up all night partying or studying or playing computer games or something like that, then you get tired over time, but when morning comes you might find that you get sort of a new lease of life, a new kind of burst of energy. And so the idea here is that you can think of this in terms of a period of biological night where there are chemical processes happening in our body, like the release of melatonin, that are promoting sleep at a particular time each day, regardless of whether we're actually sleeping or not. And then a period of biological day where there are different chemical processes, like a reduction in the release of melatonin, that are promoting wakefulness. Okay, so these endogenous rhythms of sleep are usually synchronized with the day-night cycle. So we sleep at nighttime typically and we're awake during the day. But this isn't always the case. And so you may have noticed in this plot that I showed you before that the squirrel has this regular pattern to its sleep. It's sleeping for about the same amount of time each day. But the particular time that it goes to sleep and wakes up is changing a little bit each day. And that occurs because the length of its endogenous circadian rhythm in this case is slightly shorter than the 24-hour cycle of daylight that we base our clocks on. This is an example from a study in humans where for the first few days of the study they were recording their sleeping patterns in a kind of regular environment where the sun comes up in the morning and goes down at night. And the black bar here is indicating when they're sleeping. You can see that they sleep for about 8 hours or so each day. They're falling asleep and waking up around the same time. And then from day 5 onwards, they're kept in an environment, or they're living in an environment that limits external cues to sleep. So they don't know when the sun is coming up, they don't have much indication of what time it is. And they still sleep for a fairly consistent period each day, but it's no longer synchronized with the time on the clocks. It's what's called a free running cycle. So in order for our endogenous circadian rhythm to be properly synchronized with the cycle of daylight, typically it requires exposure to external cues that signal to our body when we want to be sleeping and when we want to be awake. And so sunlight is the most obvious of these cues. It's a strong signal to when it's daytime versus nighttime. But things like exercise, the timing of our meals and the temperature of the environment that we're in can also play a role in signaling to our body when it's time to sleep versus when it's time to be awake. A study that I think illustrates this nicely, what they did is they compared the sleeping patterns of people in Germany who lived in different sort of towns across Germany. And so Germany has a single time zone, so the time on the clocks in the east of Germany is the same as it is in the west of Germany. But because the Earth is spinning in a particular direction, it means that the sun comes up in the morning about half an hour earlier in the east of Germany compared to when it comes up in the west of Germany. And what they found is that people living in towns on the east of Germany correspondingly tended to, on average, wake up half an hour earlier and go to bed half an hour earlier compared to people in the west of Germany, even though the time on the clock is the same. So it's an illustration of how our sleeping patterns tend to kind of spontaneously synchronize themselves with these cues in our environment, like the rising of the sun, that help to signal to our body the 24-hour cycle of day and night. Another phenomenon that's related to this that I think all of us have experienced is jet lag. When we fly to another country that's in a different time zone where the sun comes up at a different time, and we find that our sleeping patterns are still on Singapore time, which can keep us awake at night time and make us sleepy during the day. What's illustrated here is a particular trip that I make each year when I visit my parents who live in Melbourne. And there's a 3-hour difference between Singapore and Melbourne at the time of year that I go, meaning that the sun rises in the morning about 3 hours earlier in Melbourne than it does in Singapore. And so when you first arrive in Melbourne from Singapore, you experience what's called a phase delay, which is where your endogenous circadian rhythm that's partly controlling when you sleep is 3 hours behind the day-night cycle of the local environment. So meaning when it's getting dark and the locals are starting to go to sleep, you're still wide awake. And when the sun comes up in the morning, you still want to kind of sleep in for another 3 hours. And then as you spend time in that environment and you're exposed to these external cues that signal to your body the timing of the day-night cycle, like exposure to sunlight, maybe you're having your meals at times based off the kind of local time, your endogenous circadian rhythm synchronizes with life in that that new environment, and that leads to the opposite problem of a phase advance when you return to Singapore, where you're still on Melbourne time and your body wants to go to sleep 3 hours before people usually do in Singapore. Okay, so the key points here are that our body has this endogenous circadian rhythm that promotes a roughly 24-hour cycle of sleep and alertness. And this internal rhythm is synchronized with the 24-hour cycle of day and night that we base our clocks on in our local environment by these external cues that we're exposed to, like sunlight. Okay, so we can do a quick poll everywhere question. So the question here is that if we're kept in constant darkness, the timing of our sleep may lose synchrony with the day-night cycle of the Earth. Why aren't we born with an internal clock that is perfectly synchronized to the day-night cycle of the Earth? Is it because evolution has been unable to adapt us to the day-night cycle of the Earth? Is it because some people may have perfect synchronization, but like any trait, there will be variability between people? Is it because the length and timing of the day depends on the seasons and your geographical location? Or is it because exposure to exogenous cues like light and coffee is needed to produce a circadian rhythm of sleep? Okay, so the majority are going with C, which I agree is the right answer, and some people also put B or D. And so the reason D is not quite right is because while it's true that exogenous cues can influence our sleep, they're not needed to produce a circadian rhythm of sleep. We saw that even if we or other animals are kept in complete darkness that lack those kind of cues, the body will still generate a circadian rhythm of sleep, a sort of roughly 24-hour cycle between sleep and wakefulness. And the role of these cues is partly in helping to synchronize that internal cycle with the external environment. C is right because as we just sort of touched on in the context of jet lag, the timing of day and night depends on our geographical location. It also depends on the time of year. So that's not so obvious in Singapore, where we're near the equator, but in many countries closer to the poles, there are these very noticeable differences in the timing of when the sun comes up that vary with the seasons. And so because of that, there isn't really any such thing as perfect synchronization, because you couldn't really be born with perfect synchronization, because if you were perfectly synchronized to the environment in Singapore, then you wouldn't be synchronized with the environment kind of elsewhere in the world. And so for that reason, while B kind of looks reasonable at first glance, it isn't quite right here. And we instead have this mechanism that produces a kind of roughly 24-hour cycle in our sleep. But then in addition to that, that cycle can be kind of pushed around and synchronized with our environment through exposure to these external cues. Okay. So where does this endogenous circadian rhythm come from? It turns out that there's a key area of our brain that's involved in coordinating this, and this is referred to as the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or SCN. So in a couple of previous lectures, when we talked about perception, we mentioned the role of the thalamus, this sort of central subcortical region of our brain located around here that receives information from our senses and then forwards that onto the cortex. Just below that is this structure highlighted in purple here called the hypothalamus, another subcortical part of our brain. And the SCN is this little nucleus highlighted in green here that is a part of the hypothalamus. And it's found in humans, it's also found in other mammals. And so on the right here, we have a coronal cross-section of the brain of a rat, and the SEN are these structures at the bottom here. So our endogenous circadian rhythms are usually very robust. So they, even if we're kept in darkness, they keep happening. We still have this regular cycle to our sleep. Even if we're very ill or our brain is damaged, the circadian rhythms will usually keep occurring. We'll still sleep for a period each day. But the exception is when there's damage to this particular part of the brain, the SCN. And so that's illustrated here, taking data from a study in rats. And so rats are nocturnal. They are usually awake during the night and sleep during the day. So this rat pictures during the daytime must be up past its bedtime. And that sleeping pattern is illustrated in the plot here with the solid line, where during the day, the rat is more often sleeping, and then come nighttime, the rat is spending a lot less time asleep. In the dashed line, it represents what happens to the rat's sleeping patterns when its SEN is lesioned. So the rat is still sleeping, but there's no consistent cycle. There's no obvious sort of 24-hour cycle to its sleeping patterns. It's just as likely to be sleeping during the day as it is during the night. Interestingly, the neurons found in the SEN produce circadian rhythms in their activity, their firing, spontaneously. And so that's illustrated here from a study that inserted electrodes or implanted electrodes into the brain of rats to record the activity of individual neurons in the SEN as well as some other parts of the brain. At the top here, you see a representation of this circadian rhythm in the activity of neurons occurring in the SEN and partly also in other parts of the brain, where the neurons are becoming more active at night when the rat is more active and less active at day. And then the interesting part in this study is that they then cut the connections between the SEN and other parts of the brain. And so the SEN is still in the rat's brain, but they've just sort of used a surgical knife to cut the axons that connect between the SEN and other regions of the brain. And then they found that in other regions of the brain that they were recording from, those circadian rhythms in their activity disappeared, whereas in the SEN, there was still evidence of the neurons there producing these circadian rhythms in their activity, even though they're not receiving any information from the rest of the brain. And so what it suggests is that neurons in the SEN are spontaneously generating circadian rhythms in their activity. It's something that they will do themselves without any kind of input from elsewhere, whereas other parts of the brain are producing circadian rhythms or showing circadian rhythms in their activity that they're kind of getting from the SEN, from input from the SEN. So the idea then is that the SEN is generating these circadian rhythms and then controlling other parts of our brain to help coordinate sleeping patterns. One part of the brain that it interacts with is called the pineal gland, which is highlighted here, this very small gland in our brain. And the pineal gland is what's called an endocrine gland, which means that it is manufacturing and releasing hormones into our bloodstream. And one hormone in particular that it produces is melatonin, that we mentioned briefly before. And so melatonin is this hormone that's released into our bloodstream, and it tends to increase in the evening, peak sort of during the night, which is illustrated here, and then reduces again by morning time. And it has this role in promoting sleep. So it's able to bind to receptors in different parts of our brain as well as other organs in our body. And and seems to promote sleep. And so you may know that melatonin is sometimes used as a treatment for or for jet lag, for example. And so taking melatonin orally can make you sleepy, can promote sleep. And so the idea here is that the SCN is generating this circadian rhythm of activity, then interacting with other areas of our brain, like the pineal gland, to control things like the release of melatonin in order to promote sleep at certain times of day and promote wakefulness at other times of day. Okay, and then finally, a feature of our circadian rhythms that we've seen is that they can be kind of pushed around, or their timing can be shifted by exposure to external cues like light. And it turns out that these rhythms of activity in the SCN can similarly be affected by our exposure to light. There's actually a special system that seems to underlie this, where in electron vision we saw that light is detected in our retina by the rod and the cone cells. Those signals are sent to the thalamus and then onwards to the visual cortex at the back of our brain. It turns out that there's a specialized system that's feeding information about the level of light in our environment to the SCN. So there's what's called a retinohypothalamic tract, which is part of the optic nerve that connects between the retina, but in this case, the hypothalamus and the SCN. And interestingly, the information that the SCN is receiving actually doesn't seem to depend on the rod and the cone cells in our retina. That instead, there's this specialized subset of ganglion cells in our retina that are actually able to detect light directly by virtue of these photopigments that they contain called melanopsin. So they're actually ganglion cells that are responding to light directly. And it's these cells that are sending signals to the SCN that carry information about the kind of general level of light that we're being exposed to. And so in that way, the SCN is getting this information about when the sun is coming up and when it's going down and so on. Okay, so the key points here are that the cyclical nature of sleep patterns is driven by activity in this part of our brain, the SCN. Rhythmic firing of neurons in this region of the brain influences activity in other regions of the brain as well, including controlling the function of the pineal gland that produces melatonin. And the timing of these endogenous rhythms of activity in the SCN can also be altered via this retinohypothalamic pathway that is signaling broad changes in the level of light in our environment. Okay, so let's do another poll everywhere question. See how you're following along. So the question here is, how might your sleeping patterns change if the cells in your retina all ceased to function one day? Would you predict that sleep might occur at random times rather than in a roughly 24-hour cycle between sleep and wakefulness? Would you expect that a 24-hour cycle of sleep would still occur, but it might fall out of synchrony with the cycle of night and day? Do you think that sleep would still be synchronized with night and day as usual? Do you think that it will be easier to sleep for longer without sunlight waking you up in the morning? Okay, so most people put B and a few people put D. I think that makes good sense. So B is sort of meant to be the correct answer here, so good job. We saw how when people are kept in, or other animals are kept in darkness, they still display this kind of roughly 24-hour cycle in their sleep, but it can fall out of synchrony with the day-night cycle that our clocks are based on. And this is similar to what's happening if the cells in our retina cease to function, that our SCN, for example, would no longer be getting information about the level of light in our environment, similar to a situation where we're just in constant darkness. A is describing more what we would expect if the SCN is damaged, that people may still sleep, but without that endogenous circadian rhythm generated by the SCN, they may just sleep at random times rather than in a sort of regular cycle. D, which some of you put as well, I think is also a reasonable answer. That we've seen that light is, of course, one of these external cues that can kind of push around our sleeping patterns and wake us up when we're asleep. And so if we're not exposed to light in the morning, it may well be easier for us to sleep longer in the morning. Okay, so now we can look a little bit more about what's happening in the brain when we sleep. And so in terms of how we describe what sleep is, one way of defining it is in terms of our own subjective experience of sleep, that we know that when we sleep, what happens? We feel tired, we lie down, we close our eyes, we kind of lose consciousness for a period, maybe we dream a bit, and then sometime later we wake up. We can also describe sleep in terms of what we observe in another person's behaviour, that a person who is asleep is obviously less active and less responsive to their environment. And then finally, it turns out that we can also define sleep or describe sleep in terms of specific changes in patterns of activity that are happening in the brain. And it turns out that throughout the night, our brain is actually transitioning between these distinct stages that are defined by different patterns of activity in our brain. This isn't something that's obvious from the outside. So if you observe somebody sleeping, it's not obvious that their brain is transitioning between different stages of sleep, but it's something that became apparent once we started recording brain activity while a person sleeps. And so this usually involves studies where subjects will sleep overnight in the lab, while their brain activity is being recorded typically with EEG. So you'll remember from one of the earlier lectures that EEG involves placing these flat electrodes just on the surface of the scalp. So it's a non-invasive technique. It doesn't involve inserting anything into the brain. And these electrodes are picking up the sum activity of many neurons that are present in the cortex or other parts of the brain that are underneath the place where the electrode is put. The EEG signal from a single electrode might look something like this blue pattern here, where what this is representing are changes in the voltage recorded from this electrode over the course of about, I think it's sort of 15 seconds or so here. And when we're awake, often what we see is a pattern like this, which is characterized by this high frequency activity where the voltage that's recorded is rapidly going up and down about 8 to 12 times a second. And what that reflects is this asynchronous kind of chaotic or uncoordinated activity of different neurons that may be involved in different tasks in the brain. So there may be neurons that are processing different types of information, for example. And then when we fall asleep, one key difference that occurs in our brain activity, and particularly when we reach deeper stages of sleep, is the emergence of these slow, large amplitude waves or oscillations in the EEG signal. And this is referred to as slow wave sleep. And it becomes increasingly apparent as we get to the deeper stages of sleep. So at the top here, we see some slow waves emerging. And at the bottom, we're going into an even deeper stage of sleep where there's even more of these slow waves of activity. And what that reflects is greater synchronization in the firing of neurons in the brain. So to illustrate that, at the bottom here is a wave, like an oscillation or a cycle in the activity recorded from an EEG electrode. And that wave can be explained in terms of the synchronization of firing of neurons in the brain that underlie that signal that's recorded. And so in reality, a particular electrode would be recording activity of thousands or maybe more neurons at once. In this example, we're simplifying it by just imagining that there's two neurons here. These black lines are representing action potentials when the neuron is firing. And if we have a period where these two neurons are producing action potentials around the same time, we have this sort of boost in the voltage that's recorded from the electrode. And then we have a period where the two neurons are silent. They're both not producing action potentials, leading to this drop in activity recorded at the electrode. And then a period where they're both firing again, leading to this boost in activity. And so that kind of wave-like pattern in the EEG signal that we see here can be explained by this synchronization of neural firing, where neurons are kind of firing at the same time, and then they're silent at the same time, and so on. Okay, so one key stage of sleep is this slow wave sleep that's characterized by these slow, large amplitude waves in brain activity. Another key stage of sleep is referred to as rapid eye movement, or REM sleep. And as the name suggests, it's characterized by these eye movements. So the person is asleep, their eyes are closed, but their eyes are kind of moving back and forth. It's kind of a slightly creepy thing that we all do every night. And that's represented here. So the red line here is a recording of the person's eye movements, where when the line moves up, they're moving their eyes to the left. When it moves down, they're moving their eyes to the right. And so during this REM sleep, people's eyes start kind of moving back and forth. In addition, their brain activity changes as well. So those slow waves in the EEG signal that we saw here disappear, and instead their brain activity becomes more kind of irregular or chaotic, like a bit more similar to the waking state. Okay. So the idea is that when we fall asleep, we initially enter these early stages of sleep called stage 1 and stage 2 sleep, which I haven't really talked about here, but are these lighter stages of sleep where it's easier to wake the person up. We then will typically enter slow wave sleep, then after a while transition back to stage 2, then into REM sleep, and then for the rest of the night we will tend to go through this cycle that lasts for about 90 minutes or so, where we are transitioning back and forth between slow wave sleep and REM sleep. And so there will be differences between people and across nights, but a single night might look something like this, where the person is falling asleep around 11 p.m. or so. They initially go into here stage 2 and then slow wave sleep in blue here. Then they have a short period of REM sleep, then they're back to slow wave sleep, REM sleep, slow wave, REM, and so on. And one thing that you might notice in this pattern here is that earlier in the night, there are longer periods of slow wave sleep, whereas later in the night, closer to morning, we tend to experience longer periods of REM sleep. Okay, and then an interesting feature of this REM sleep is that it's linked closely to dreams. And so many studies have invited participants to sleep over in the lab, recorded their brain activity with EEG in order to determine what stage of sleep they're in, and then woken them up during particular stages of sleep and asked them whether they were dreaming or not. And a number of studies have found that most of the time when you wake someone up from REM sleep, they're dreaming, or they say that they were dreaming. So dreams can also occur in the other stages of sleep, but they seem to be less common. And so you can think of REM sleep then as being this more active stage of sleep. So the person is still asleep, but their brain activity is starting to become a bit more like the waking state. they're having these conscious experiences of dreams, and in addition, their eyes start moving around. And there are different ideas about why our eyes move during REM sleep, but one way of thinking about it is in terms of us kind of looking around at things happening in our dream. Another feature of REM sleep is the presence of what's called muscle atonia. And so when we sleep and enter REM sleep, our eyes can move, but generally our body remains still. And we all know that our dreams can be very active. So during REM sleep, our brain is sort of coming alive in a sense and generating these dreams. Often our dreams involve talking to people and trying to get to the exam hall on time and things like this, so they can be quite active. But despite that, our body generally remains still. And it turns out that there's a particular mechanism that seems to be responsible for that. That when we enter REM sleep, a particular region of our brainstem contains neurons that send inhibitory signals to the motor neurons in our spine that help to control the main muscles of our body. And that by inhibiting those motor neurons, it means that even if our brain is becoming active, producing these dreams that might include sort of commands from the brain to move the body, those commands won't get through. They won't cause our body to move because our brainstem is inhibiting the motor neurons that control our muscles. And interestingly, there was a study that studied dreaming in cats. And what they did is they actually, in these cats, they lesioned this part of the brainstem that has a role in inhibiting motor neurons during REM sleep. They recorded the brain activity of the cats, and they saw that as they went to sleep, as they entered REM sleep, they then started to become active. So they still appeared to be asleep, their eyes were still closed and so on, but they started sort of walking around, and the way they describe it is that they appeared to be kind of acting out their dreams, like even sort of looking at and pouncing on like an imaginary prey and things like that. So suggesting that the our body remaining still during our dreams, during REM sleep, may depend on this particular mechanism in our brain that is inhibiting the motor neurons in our body. Okay. So in general, dreams are a kind of hallucination. So they're experiences that we have of seeing things, hearing things. Often they're tied together into a narrative that we experience, but they're not tied to reality. They don't reflect the real state of the environment around us when we're sleeping in our bed. Often when we're having a dream, you may find that you're not really aware that you're dreaming. It's only when you wake up that you kind of just realize that it was a dream. And often people would, say that they don't really have much control over their dreams. An exception is something called lucid dreams, which some people experience, where the person is aware that they're having a dream while they're still in the dream, and because of that, they may have sort of more conscious control over what's happening in the dream. There was an interesting study, I thought, that studied lucid dreaming. And what they did is set up a method for communicating with somebody while they're having a dream. So they recruited people who report often experiencing lucid dreams, where they're aware that they're in a dream. And then while that person was awake, they trained them to respond to simple questions, like maths questions, for example, using their eye movements. So the logic being that we know during REM sleep that the body is sort of mostly paralyzed by this process of muscle atonia, but we know that the eyes move, so the eyes are not unable to move. And so what they'll do is they would ask them questions like, what is 1 + 1? And the person would respond to that by moving their eyes back and forth 2 times. And then they got the person to go to sleep. They recorded their brain activity using EEG to identify what stage of sleep they were in. And when they entered REM sleep, they then started asking the sleeping person, questions out loud. So in this example, they're showing some data from one trial. The EEG activity during REM sleep is shown in blue here. Eye movements are shown in red. And in this example, the researcher is asking the sleeping person, what is 1 plus 2? And here the person appears to be responding by moving their eyes back and forth 3 times, which is pretty amazing. And then they would later kind of wake the person up and ask them, were you dreaming? What happened in the dream? And in this example, the person is describing how they were having this dream of sitting in their car, and at some point they could hear the researcher's voice that appeared to be coming through the stereo of the car, and then they remembered they're meant to sort of respond to the questions by moving their eyes. It's a pretty cool study, I think. So the key points here are that our brain undergoes these distinct changes in activity when we sleep. And a key distinction is between slow wave sleep, which is characterized by these slow oscillations in the firing of neurons, and REM sleep that is characterized by these eye movements, muscle atonia, or paralysis of the muscles, and the greater occurrence of dreams. Okay. So just to finish up before we have a break, in terms of the mechanisms that are involved in regulating the transition between sleep and wakefulness and these different stages of sleep, we've looked a bit at the role of the SCN in producing this endogenous circadian rhythm. But there are also a number of other brain areas and neurotransmitter systems that are involved in regulating sleep and wakefulness. And some of those are illustrated here. So there's a region of the brainstem, the pons and the midbrain that have a role in releasing the inhibitory neurotransmitter GABA in our brain that inhibits neural activity in different parts of the brain and has a role in promoting sleep. And then there are these other areas of the brain that have a role in promoting wakefulness instead. So one that I mentioned early in the course is a subcortical region called the locus coeruleus, which is located here. And this contains neurons that can produce neuromodulator noradrenaline and release it widely across different parts of the cortex and the brain more generally. And it has the effect of enhancing neural activity, and this seems to increase alertness. Along similar lines, a part of the hypothalamus releases a neurotransmitter called orexin that I'll come back to a bit later. And this also has an effect on our brain of enhancing neural activity and helping to promote wakefulness throughout the day. So the details here are not so important to remember, but the general point is that there are a variety of brain areas and neurotransmitters that help to regulate the transition between waking and sleeping states of the brain. And sleep generally tends to depend on greater neural inhibition, the kind of dampening down of activity in the brain, while wakefulness depends on neural excitation, a general upregulation of activity in the brain. Okay, so let's have a break for 7 minutes or so and come back at 3 o'clock. Thanks. Okay, so I better get started again. So now we can look at some disorders of sleep or disturbances of sleep that people can experience. And so insomnia is a general term for inadequate sleep. What we consider to be inadequate differs between different people, but generally it's defined in terms of the amount of or adequate sleep is defined in terms of the amount of sleep that you need to not feel tired the next day. As well as tiredness, insomnia can involve impairments in cognitive processes like memory and attention, and changes to a person's mood as well. There are many causes of insomnia. It can result from a kind of misalignment between a person's endogenous circadian rhythm and the kind of lifestyle that they're trying to lead, caused by jet lag, for example, that we saw earlier. And as you know, there are many other things that can interfere with our sleep. So noise, heat, stress, diet, medication, illness, and so on. There's been quite a lot of research in recent years into how insomnia impacts on mental and physical health. If you're interested in reading more about that, there's a link to a review here that you might find useful. But what I'm going to focus on here are some kind of more rare sleep disturbances, which are narcolepsy, sleepwalking, and sleep paralysis. So narcolepsy is this disturbance of sleep where the person tends to experience these kind of sudden attacks of sleep during their kind of usual waking hours. And that's illustrated in this video.
Because the genes of dogs and humans are so similar, other scientists are using dogs to discover clues to some of the most vexing of human genetic diseases. With the help of Dobermans like Blitzen and Donner, and a dachshund named Bo, Emmanuel Mignot has already made a discovery that could improve millions of human lives. Bo has narcolepsy. At moments of high emotion, he loses muscle control and appears to fall asleep. Good canned food is enough to bring on an attack. On the rare occasions when Bo slips off into the hall, everyone knows there's no reason to race after him. Narcolepsy is far more common in people than it is in dogs. But it's easier to study in inbred dogs because they have so much less genetic variation. Not that it was easy.
The process of finding the gene was a very, very long ordeal. And I have to say, I amazed myself with my patients. Even so, at the end, we were so tired, we couldn't believe we would finally get the gene. We discovered something that may have clinical application for narcoleptic patients. And that is a dream for a researcher. We look hard for this gene, but we would not have dreamt that what we found could have been useful quickly. And I think there is a good chance that new medication will come out directly from that research for human patients. And that's really a plus.
Okay, so narcolepsy involves these kind of sudden attacks of sleepiness. Sometimes it can happen during emotional reactions. So in that video, you saw that the dogs, when he kind of feeds them some food, it suddenly kind of prompts them to fall asleep. So they get really excited about the food, and it's thought to partly reflect these intrusions of REM sleep into the waking state. So where the person is kind of transitioning directly from being awake to being into REM sleep. You saw in that video that when these sleep attacks happen in these dogs, and the same is true in humans as well, that they kind of fall to the ground, and this reflects what's called cataplexy, which is sort of muscle weakness, and that may relate to this process of muscle atonia that we talked about that occurs during REM sleep. That usually when we enter REM sleep, our brainstem begins to inhibit the motor neurons in our spine that control our muscles, causing them to be paralyzed or inactive. And that process suddenly happening while the person is kind of standing up may then be what causes them to sort of fall down as they have these attacks of sleepiness. These plots illustrate the stages of wakefulness and sleep that a person is going through across a 24-hour period. These are two people, two children, one with narcolepsy at the top and one without at the bottom. In the control participant, you can see that they're awake, which is represented by the line up here for most of the day. Then as night falls, they're transitioning through these different stages of sleep, where slow wave sleep is represented at the bottom here. REM sleep is represented in blue. And in the child with narcolepsy, they're sleeping throughout the night, but during the day as well, they're having these sort of prolonged naps, that kind of intermittent periods, and also these moments where they're sort of transitioning rapidly between wakefulness and REM sleep. It turns out that narcolepsy is related to low levels of the neurotransmitter orexin in the brain. And so I mentioned orexin a moment ago. It's this neurotransmitter that's released by the hypothalamus. It's released across different areas of our brain and seems to have this role of enhancing neural activity and maintaining wakefulness throughout the day. And so in people with narcolepsy, there seems to be less of this neurotransmitter. On the right here is a figure from a study that was examining the post-mortem brains of people who had narcolepsy and people without. And what this is illustrating is a section of the hypothalamus in two different people, and where they've stained the brain tissue with a chemical that attaches itself to neurons that produce orexin. And so on the left here, you can see that there are many of these neurons that are visualized in the hypothalamus of a person without narcolepsy. On the right, in a person who did have narcolepsy, there's a much lower density of these neurons that produce orexin. So this lack of orexin seems to make them susceptible to kind of just fall asleep at sort of random times throughout the day. Another interesting disturbance of sleep is sleepwalking. And so that's illustrated in this video. So this is a YouTuber on the right here who filmed his mum sleepwalking. And in this video, he's showing his mum this video of her sleepwalking.
Okay, here we go.
My mom's sleepwalking.
And what exactly are you doing there?
Come on, Nick. Who is... Oh! It's a special code.
Is it?
Oh my God. I was trying to open your tomato cage.
The tomato cage.
Yeah, I was doing a special thing. So the tomato cage wouldn't open.
And where is this tomato cage?
Someplace. I tried many things. But it wouldn't open, and I'm pissed off now. Come on, this is not right.
Okay, so sleepwalking is not well understood. It's difficult to study scientifically. On the surface, it seems to reflect some parts of the brain waking up, being kind of released from the inhibition of sleep, while other parts are still asleep and inactive, and so enabling a person to kind of walk around and talk and so on, but where they're not quite there. Like people often don't remember their experiences during sleepwalking, and you can see in that video that she's not in a kind of normal sort of cognitive state. What we do know is that sleepwalking runs in families, so suggesting that there's a genetic component. There are genes that you can inherit that will make it more likely that you will experience sleepwalking. It occurs more often in children than adults, more often when we're sleep deprived or stressed. And you might, in that video, it kind of looks like she's acting out her dreams. And so you might assume that it's happening more so during REM sleep, but actually it's been found that it tends to occur more often in slow wave sleep. There's a different condition called REM behavior disorder that is linked specifically to REM sleep, and it's characterized by this loss of muscle atonia during REM sleep. So usually when we enter REM sleep, our brainstem is inhibiting the motor neurons that control our muscles, keeping our body still. In REM behavior disorder, that doesn't occur to the same extent, and as a result, the person is more able to move around during REM sleep. And this doesn't necessarily involve sleepwalking, but rather the person kind of, sort of thrashing around in bed, like moving their legs and their arms around when they're having dreams. Okay, another unusual disturbance of sleep that many people have experienced is called sleep paralysis. And this is where there is a paralysis of the body, so an inability to move while the person is kind of mostly awake. And it seems to happen sort of at the transition between sleeping and waking. So as you're just kind of falling asleep at the beginning of the night, or as you're kind of waking up during the night. And it seems to reflect that process of muscle atonia that usually occurs during REM sleep as a kind of normal process that helps to keep our body still during REM sleep, but extending into the waking period. So where the person is kind of waking up, they may be aware of the room around them, but they're unable to move their body, seemingly due to this inhibition of their muscles that occurs usually during REM sleep. What makes this experience particularly disturbing is that it's often accompanied by hallucinations. And so the person is maybe, feel awake, like able to see the room around them, but unable to move. There are common themes to these hallucinations. So people often report feeling or seeing the presence of an intruder in their room. They can often feel sensations of breathing difficulty, like a sense of something pressing on their chest, and also illusory feelings of movement, so feeling like you're floating above the bed or feeling like you're kind of falling through the bed or something like that. And an interesting feature of sleep paralysis is that there are many stories across different cultures of things like ghosts and spirits and the like that visit people during the night, press down on their chest, and in a way that sort of resembles features of sleep paralysis. So one example is the story of the old hag, which comes from Newfoundland in Canada, where people who have had this experience often report that they suddenly feel awake during the night, but unable to move or speak. They're kind of trapped in their body. And then they often feel like there's a heavy weight pressing on their chest, and sometimes they even report seeing like a person or some kind of animal like sitting on their chest. And so one way of understanding this type of phenomenon is that sleep paralysis reflects this particular biological mechanism of muscle atonia that is usually occurring during REM sleep, but in these instances extending into the waking state and keeping our body paralyzed, even though our brain more generally has become awake. And this leads to particular physical sensations, so feelings of being unable to breathe properly, because even though you will keep breathing, you don't have the same kind of conscious control over your breathing. And those physical sensations may then be incorporated into the hallucinations that people are experiencing, so leading to these kind of common themes to hallucinations that people experience in this state. And then these cultural explanations arise that try to make sense of this sort of unusual experience that different people are having. Okay. So the key points here are that sleep problems can result from various mechanisms of sleep regulation. It can occur because our endogenous circadian rhythm of sleep has become desynchronized with the night-day cycle, for example, like in the context of jet lag. It can occur because of particular neurotransmitter systems in our brain operating differently, like a lack of orexin leading to the attacks of sleepiness that characterize narcolepsy, and it can lead to differences in the process of muscle atonia, leading to us to be sort of more active when we're asleep, or kind of paralyzing our body when we're actually awake. Sometimes these sleep problems have known biological causes, like in the case of narcolepsy, there's quite a bit of evidence linking it to the function of orexin, but other times these sleep disturbances are only sort of poorly understood, like in the case of sleepwalking. Okay, so we can talk now about theories of why we sleep. And the most obvious answers to that question is because we're tired. We sleep because we're tired. But we also know that sleep is not just about kind of restoring energy or dealing with fatigue of our body. That if we have a day where we're very physically active, we go for a long run, we walk around everywhere all day, we'll sleep that night. If we have a day where we do nothing much, we just kind of lie on the couch, play PlayStation all day, then again, we'll probably sleep that night. And so it's not so obvious that sleep is really about dealing with fatigue of our body. We've also seen in this lecture that what controls our sleep in large part are these endogenous circadian rhythms, these mechanisms in the brain that have evolved, like the SCN, that are promoting a regular period of sleep each day and a period of wakefulness each day. And so the question here then is, why have we evolved in this way? What's so important about sleep that our brain has evolved mechanisms that are kind of forcing us or compelling us to sleep for a regular period each day? We don't have a full answer to that question, but there are a few key hypotheses that have emerged about the function of sleep that I'll outline. One idea is that it relates to energy conservation. So when we sleep, we're inactive, and that conserves energy. And it relates to the observation that there are particular times each day where it's more efficient to be active. It's a better use of energy to be awake. And so we live on a planet that's revolving, and as a result, we've evolved and lived our whole lives in this environment where there's a period of daylight each day and a period of darkness each day. It's warmer during the day, it's colder at night. And as a result of that, there are these distinct periods of each day where it's more efficient to be active. For us, for people who rely on vision heavily to kind of navigate the environment, it's arguably a better use of our energy to be awake and doing things during the day rather than at night. And so the idea here is that we've evolved these mechanisms in our brain to kind of force us to sleep during these inefficient periods of each day so that we're saving our energy for the periods of the day where it's more useful for us to be active. This kind of idea can help to make sense of differences in sleeping patterns that occur in different species. And so there are certain bats that are only awake for a few hours each day and spend the rest of the time sleeping. And they tend to be awake mainly in a few hours of the early evening when moths are about. And so the idea here is that these bats are being very efficient. They're being active and awake just during this short segment of each day where there's a lot of food around, where it's efficient for them to be using their energy to find food. And then during the rest of the day, when it's less efficient, there's less food around, they're sleeping to conserve energy. At the other end of the spectrum are grazing animals, which often sleep very little, so just a few hours each day, so cows, sheep and goats and so on. And these are animals that need to eat a lot to survive. They live off grass and plants and things like this. And so for this reason, that may have guided the evolution of their sleeping patterns so that they have more time each day to eat. And similarly, these are animals that are often, prey of other predators. And so another benefit of being awake for so long is that they're able to stay alert to predators. Predators like cats, for example, often sleep for kind of longer durations each day, and they're often able to eat just a kind of single rich meal which gives them what they need to survive, and then they can spend the rest of the time sleeping to conserve their energy. So the idea here is that sleeping patterns have evolved to be most efficient for the particular ecological niche that different animals live in. Another benefit of sleep is memory consolidation. So we tend to remember things better after we've slept. So to give you an example of a study that has illustrated this, in this study they asked a group of people to learn a list of words from a language that they weren't familiar with, in this case Swahili, and then they tested them on their memory of that list of words 12 hours later. And in one group, they learnt the words in the morning, and then they were tested on their memory that evening, 12 hours later. In the other group, they learnt the words in the evening, and then they were tested the following day in the morning, 12 hours later, but where they'd had the opportunity to sleep in between. And they found that the group that slept in between that period of learning and period of recall tended to remember more of the words on average, and that persisted not just the next morning but even a week later and even 6 months later. So why would sleep help with memory, with long-term memory? One way of thinking about it is that when we're awake, we're exposed to this constant stream of information. Throughout the day, there's this constant stream of new information coming in through our senses. When we're asleep, that sensory input is blocked off. Our eyes are closed, there's inhibition of parts of our brain, and that may provide the opportunity for the brain to then kind of sort through and revisit things that have happened to us that day and consolidate some things into a longer lasting form of storage. An idea related to this is called neural replay theory, which is the idea that when we're asleep, our brain is replaying experiences that we had that day. And there's some interesting studies that find some evidence for this in rats. And so in these studies, what they do is they train rats on a spatial navigation task. So where the rat is given a particular kind of maze that it has to work through, and it learns a particular route to go through the maze to reach some food, for example. And here they were recording activity in neurons in the hippocampus of the rat. And so last week when we talked about the role of the hippocampus in memory, I also touched on how there are cells in the hippocampus called place cells that are involved in representing information about our current location within a familiar environment. And that's illustrated here, where this rat is walking down this passageway, and as it walks down the passageway, there are these different cells that they're recording from in the brain, in the hippocampus, different place cells that are each becoming active when the rat is at particular locations within that passageway. So as it walks down this passageway, there's a particular sequence of activity happening across these place cells that they're recording from that seems to be representing information about the movement of the rat. And then the interesting part is that when these rats went to sleep later, after having done this task, there were periods where they found these same patterns of information, this same sequence of activation across the place cells being replayed in the rat's brain. So it's as if its brain was kind of replaying or revisiting this experience of kind of walking down this passageway that it had been doing during that day. Okay. And so one other idea that has become more popular recently about the purpose of sleep or the benefit of sleep is that it has a role in removing waste products from our brain. And so when our neurons are active, particularly during the day, there's this metabolic waste that builds up in our brain. And so one example is this protein amyloid that is a byproduct of processes happening in our brain. We touched on this last week as well in the context of Alzheimer's disease, where we saw that in the brain of people with Alzheimer's disease, there can be this unusual accumulation of amyloid protein in the brain that seems to have a role in disrupting the function of neurons and eventually causing them to die off. And so in order to keep our neurons healthy, then our brain may need to be constantly kind of removing these waste products from the brain. That seems to partly involve the movement of cerebrospinal fluid within our brain. And so in the lecture on anatomy, we saw how there are these structures in the brain called ventricles, these sort of reservoirs in the brain that are filled with fluid that's called cerebrospinal fluid. That fluid is also around the kind of outer surface of our brain, within our skull, and even sort of around our spinal cord as well. And it turns out that fluid isn't completely stationary. It's flowing to some extent around our head. And it seems to play a role partly in helping to kind of wash away waste products in our brain into our blood supply so that they can then be kind of removed from the brain. And so that idea is illustrated in this little animation, where what we're looking at here are neurons. We have this amyloid protein, these little black dots that have built up in the brain as the neurons are active. And then we have this cerebrospinal fluid that's kind of flowing through the brain and helping to kind of wash away these waste products. And it turns out that flow of cerebrospinal fluid happens to a greater extent when we're asleep. And so sleep may be this critical period each day where our neurons are less active, so they're producing less of these waste products. There's more flow of this cerebrospinal fluid that helps to wash them away. And so together that may provide a good opportunity for the brain to kind of catch up on this housekeeping each day. Okay, so the key points here are that sleep may have evolved partly to conserve energy during periods of the day where being active is less efficient, less useful, or even dangerous. Sleep appears to also have a role in helping to consolidate learning. And sleep is also a time where the clearance of waste products from the brain may be more efficient as well. Okay, so to finish up with, I want to say something brief about dreaming as well. And so why do we dream? So unfortunately the answer to that question is not very satisfying, that we don't really know for sure. And the reason for that is that studying dreaming is quite difficult. So it relies largely on self-report, on asking someone, were you dreaming? What were you dreaming about? And so on. But to do that, to get that information, you need to wake them up from the dream, so ending the dream. And as I think we've all experienced, dreams also tend to be very sort of poorly remembered. For most of us, I think that memory of the dream fades away very quickly when we wake up. Despite that, there are some interesting ideas about where dreaming comes from that have emerged in the literature that have a kind of biological perspective. So these are the activation synthesis hypothesis and the neurocognitive model. So in the first of these, the idea is that when we're asleep, there's some kind of internally generated and random activity happening in our brain. So this has been observed during REM sleep, where we know dreams often occur, where it's been found that there are these internally generated activity happening in the brainstem initially that flows up through the thalamus and to the visual cortex at the back of our head, causing this this kind of random activity in our visual cortex while we're asleep. So usually when we're awake, we have all this information, this stimulation coming in through our eyes, being sent to our visual cortex, and that's being processed by our brain and being linked to memories and things like that. When we're asleep, that usual sensory input is shut off, but we still have this seemingly random activity happening to some extent in our kind of visual cortex. And the idea then is that our brain is then taking that random activity and then trying to come up with a story that makes sense of that. So linking it to memories and trying to interpret that random activity. And in this way, we get this kind of bizarre quality of dreams where we're having these visual experiences, for example, but oftentimes they're a bit kind of bizarre and don't quite make sense. Another idea is the neurocognitive model, which instead compares dreams to the sort of normal process of mind wandering and visual imagery that we experience when we're awake. And so during this lecture, there would have been times where your mind wandered off. Maybe you're thinking about how great your lunch was or what you're going to do tonight and so on. And so mind wandering, and it often includes kind of visual imagery, is a sort of normal state, a function that our brain is capable of in general. But when we're awake, there's this constant stream of sensory input from our environment that is helping to kind of tether us back to reality and kind of limiting the extent of that sort of mind wandering. And so the idea here is that when we're asleep, our eyes are closed, there's inhibition of some of the parts of our brain that is blocking off that usual sensory input. It gives our brain free rein to kind of generate visual imagery and sort of this kind of mind wandering, and that leads to the process of dreaming, where we have these kind of vivid conscious experiences of things that are not really happening, and where those experiences are often related to recent memories that we have, concerns that we have during waking, and so on. So the idea here is that dreaming is a bit like thinking, but under this very unusual state where there's no sort of real information coming in from the outside to tie us back to reality. Okay, so the key points here are that dreams might reflect random internally generated activity in our sensory cortex during sleep, which our brain is then weaving together into a narrative. Or it might resemble something like everyday mind wandering and visual imagery in a state where we're uninterrupted by real sensory input. Or it might just reflect something else. And so because of the difficulty in studying dreaming scientifically, a lot of these ideas are still a bit speculative. And so it's still unclear whether dreaming is an important function that has evolved for a purpose, or whether it's more like an accidental byproduct of other functions of our brain. Okay, so I should finish up, but if you have any questions, you're welcome to come up and ask me. And next week, we have our final lecture, which will be on evolution and genetics. So thank you. I'll see you then.